I could turn pennies to gold, I'd feed all of my friends and all of my foes. Add to me to the bone, provide the needed clothes, plant some seeds in the road with what they needed to grow. If I could turn water to wine, I'd leave the power behind, cause clean water's getting harder to find. People are dying and going blind, it's only a matter of time till we collapse this design.
And in my mind, we should just try to rewind to a better time and set aside our differences. Give into the magnificence, but less and plan more to create some photosynthesis.
And this is it, one life that we're given. We need water and oxygen to live and keep wishing. Kill the cynicism, turn off your televisions, cause our vision is different than the politicians, y'all. It takes a village.
And I wish that life was more than me just trying to get by. And that I could get it right just one time. Just one time.
One time, one mind, crossing over border lines with knowledge instead of ammunition. It's getting hot in this kitchen, it's time to switch up position. Put some love in the mission before this all becomes cataclysmic. Capitalism got us wishing we had the power of alchemy, so we could turn pennies to gold and throw them off the balcony in hopes to help the needy, the bleeding and huddled masses, instead of feeding elitists and greedy bastards. To the casket, I'll be fighting for my rights, cuz I deserve to be free and try to get it right at least once. Push comes to shove, we need peace in our lives before our souls release to the sky.
I wish that life was more than me just trying to get by. And that I could get it right just one time. Just one time.
Welcome to the Shakti report. Good day, good day. How's everybody doing? Woo! Getting my microphone untangled here. Welcome. I'm so excited to share some hopefully enlightening information with you today. And that first song I was playing was Grim and Darling is the name of the musician, and Alchemy is the song. So, welcome. Loki wants to say hi. Hey, Loki. Say hi. Who's that? And hopefully you can see that. I'm not sure if I directed it in the right direction. But welcome to the Shakti Report. Today we're talking about what real protest looks like and some definitions of some words that I think are vital to consider because the mainstream media is throwing them around like banshees, as they like to do. As always, at the end of this video, in the actual video event, you will find the resources. So all the articles, video, anything I'm going to mention here, I will put links to there. So, getting started here, talking about nationalism and globalism, and kind of the definitions of those words. But I think the, it's just like important to note here, as I've looked at some of the mainstream media, news media, I've seen a lot of, when I look at the overall story of Antifa and the alt-right and all of this, I see this like demonization to nationalism or like nationalist in general. So since we're demonizing that word, I think it's really important we understand what that means, and kind of try to ask ourselves, why is there this like sudden campaign? Ooh, Siri, stop listening to me. Why is there this sudden campaign to, demonize nationalism, and what is it really? And when you read some of these articles or see some of this stuff, what I'm seeing is that there's supposed to be this connection made between nationalism and racism, and I don't think that the two have anything really to do with each other. It depends on the person. But nationalism in and of itself, let's look at some definitions. And also I wanted to pull up definitions from Merriam-Webster dictionary as well, because you'll see Merriam-Webster is very just American. So, and it's updated constantly, and these words are super old, so yeah, anyway, that's all I'm going to say. So I wanted to look against Wikipedia, which I find Wikipedia, as far as definitions go, is a really good source and tends to be older definitions that it gives first, like the root definition, the original definition, whereas when you look up something like Merriam-Webster, they're updating every year, and yeah, and they're clearly American, biased with the English, I guess. Yeah, okay. So let's just look at two definitions of nationalism. Wikipedia says nationalism is a range of political, social, and economic systems characterized by promoting the interests of a particular nation, particularly with the aim of gaining and maintaining self-governance or full sovereignty over the group's homeland. The political ideology therefore holds that a nation should govern itself free from unwanted outside interference, and is linked to the concept of self-determination. Nationalism is further oriented toward developing and maintaining a national identity based on shared circumstances such as culture, language, religion, political goals, beliefs, race, and common ancestry. Nationalism, therefore, seeks to preserve the nation's culture. It often also involves a sense of pride in the nation's achievements and is closely linked to the concept of patriotism. In some cases, nationalism referred to the belief that a nation should be able to control the government and all means of its production. Okay, so it goes on, and again, I'll give these links. Okay, so that's a long, lengthy, but in a nutshell, it's basically, it's not patriotism, so it's not like, yay, America, but it's a sense of, I'd say a sense of boundaries, like everybody wants to come to this country. If we had free and open borders, like we can't do that, clearly. I don't think that people should be kicked out of this country once that they have settled here. But if we want to look at a free and open border, like, which would be the opposite of nationalism, basically this is like keeping our sovereignty, like, okay, this is, you can't just come in and like take our goods and services and whatnot, and, wood and forests and oil and all that, because we're our own country and these are our goods and services to sell to you if we choose to. So that's sovereignty, right? Anyway, moving on. Okay, so the definition of Merriam-Webster of nationalism. This one says, loyalty and devotion to a nation, especially a sense of national consciousness, exalting one nation above all others, and placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests as opposed to those of other nations or supranational groups. So, intense nationalism was one of the causes of war, it says. A nationalist movement or government opposing nationalisms. I would say, yeah, nationalism wouldn't be a cause of war unless you were, again, it depends on the person, unless you feel that you want to impose your way of living on someone else, which is really interesting because I never thought about that. Which is it's kind of interesting because that's kind of globalization when you impose nationalism on someone else. So that's kind of maybe a really actually not a definition of nationalism at all, Merriam-Webster. I do challenge that. Okay, so just to show you, great difference, right, in those two definitions. Again, I find that Wikipedia is a way more clear and also thorough because I don't think it's cut and dry, and nationalism is a little bit more, in depth, like, and it could, just like saying right or left doesn't really mean anything because how far right, how far left, what parts of the right, what parts of the left, it doesn't really mean anything, which is why we need to get rid of these labels because they're being used against us essentially. And right and left both agree on a globalization agenda, which I'll get to more later. So let's look at globalism, and then I'm going to show you a couple of videos. Okay, and I'm going to talk about the little event, Battle of Seattle. So in Wikipedia it says Paul James defines globalism as the dominant ideology and subjectivity associated with different historically dominant formations of global extension. The definition thus implies that there were pre-modern or traditional forms of globalism and globalization long before the driving force of capitalism sought to colonize every corner of the globe. For example, going back to the Roman Empire in the 2nd century CE and perhaps to the Greeks of the 5th century BCE, Manfred Steger distinguishes between different globalisms such as justice globalism, jihad globalism, and market globalism. Market globalism includes the ideology of neoliberalism. In some hands, the reduction of globalism is the single ideology of market globalism, and neoliberalism has led to confusion. For example, in his 2005 book, The Collapse of Globalism and the Reinvention of the World, Canadian philosopher John Ralston Saul treated globalism as, I don't know this word, coterminous with neoliberalism and neoliberal globalization. Anyway, Coterminous. He argued that, far from being an inevitable force, globalization is already breaking up into contradictory pieces, and that citizens are reasserting their national interests in both positive and destructive ways. Alternatively, American political scientist Joseph Nye, co-founder of the international relations theory of neoliberalism, generalized the term to argue that globalism refers to any description and explanation of a world which is characterized by networks of connections that span multi-continental distances, while globalization refers to the increase or decline in the degree of globalism. I'm confused. This use of the term originated in and continues to be used in academic debates about the economic, social, and cultural developments that is described as globalization. The term is used in specific and narrow way to describe a position in a debate about the historical character of globalization. Okay, so there's a lot here. This is Wikipedia again, and we're going to move on and just look at what Merriam-Webster dictionary has to say about globalism. Again, we're comparing two alternate sources, just seeing how different things can be. So here we have nice short definition once again. It says, a national policy of treating the whole world as a proper sphere for political influence. Say that's pretty good, but again, it doesn't really, it leaves me like, okay. It also says to compare it with internationalism, and it compares it with imperialism. So let's check out what Merriam says about these. Internationalism. International character, principles, interests, or outlook. So, yeah, that makes sense. Policy of cooperation among nations, an attitude or belief favoring such a policy. And imperialism, government authority system. The policy, practice, or advocacy of extending the power and dominion of a nation, especially by direct territorial acquisitions, or by gaining indirect control over the political or economic life of other areas. The extension or imposition of power, authority, or influence. Okay, so we had a little definition time, and now I'm going to show you an old school movie first. And we're going to read an article, but I feel like we need to break it up with a little bit of a movie first with all this reading. So, the old school, this is like from the 80s, I think. Let's see if it has a date. No, I don't know when it was. Well, let's see. 1991. The journalist is John Pilger, Pilger, Pilger. Again, this will be in the resources. So I'm going to show him, and we're just going to watch the first like 4 minutes of this video. So then we will move on to some other resources, but this will give you an idea of all of those all of those words we just discussed and see it more in a flow of history, information, documentary.
Remember Live Aid in 1985, that symbol of concern and generosity? Did you know that during that year, the hungriest countries in Africa gave twice as much money to us in the developed world as we gave to them? There was another famine last year. Perhaps you were one of those who took part in Red Nose Day. Did you know that before that day was over, the equivalent of all the money that Comic Relief had raised in Britain, about £12 million, had come back to the rich countries? For every day this amount is given by the poorest to the rich as interest payments on loans that most of them never asked for or knew existed. In other words, contrary to a myth long popular in the West, it's been the poor of the world who've financed the rich, not the other way round. And this film sets out to explain why. It's also a film about war. A war you don't see on your television screens, for it's seldom news. It's been described as a silent war. Instead of soldiers dying, there are children dying. More than 500,000 in 1 year, according to the United Nations. That's more than twice the number of dead in the Gulf War. Instead of the bombing of bridges, there's the tearing down of forests and other natural resources, the bulldozing of farmland, and the running down of schools and hospitals. In many ways, it's like a colonial war. The difference is that these days, people and the resources are controlled not by viceroys and occupying armies, but by other, more sophisticated means, of which the principal weapon is debt.
There are no bullets, but it's a war in which people are dying.
War and debt are exactly the same thing, except for one point, which is that nobody needs to occupy territory today.
In the 1980s, the World Bank and IMF and the US government and the British government would say to developing countries, you cut government spending, you increase exports, you privatize, or you won't get new loans.
Belt tightening is what it's called. What you do is tighten those notches that are easiest to pull. Those notches that affect children, that affect poor people, that affect people who have no power in a political system.
Part of the design of structural adjustment programs, that's what these policies are called, is to drive down real wages.
The 1980s have been a lost decade for development. The brunt has been borne by the most vulnerable groups, children or mothers with young children.
To understand the debt question, one has to understand first that what is taking place today is the greatest transfer of public wealth to private hands in the history of this earth. The process of coercing most of humanity into debt as a means of controlling their resources, their labor, and their governments began almost half a century ago. It was not called colonialism. That was a term made defunct by World War II. There were new, hopeful euphemisms. Indeed, this was the beginning of what President Bush now calls the New World Order.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort.
Along with the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank was set up at the Bretton Woods Conference in America in 1944. The bank's aim was to finance the reconstruction of Europe, then to develop the Third World. It was decided the headquarters would be in Washington, and the president would come from the country with the largest shareholding, and of course the United States is the largest shareholder. The World Bank operates under great secrecy and limited accountability. Every World Bank official is granted immunity from legal action anywhere in the world.
Summing up the importance of Bretton Woods, Mr. Vinson says,
Ours is a mission of peace, designed to establish the economic foundations of peace on the bedrock of genuine international cooperation.
What this idealism really meant was spelt out in the charter they were signing: to promote private foreign investment by means of guarantees or loans made by private investors.
The World Bank has always been deceptive about its role in the international economy. It attempts to portray itself as an institution looking out for the interest of not only poor countries, but for poor people within those countries. That has never been the case. The bank is pushing the interest, or promoting the interest, of countries in the first world and for an elite sector in the third world. That was true in the 1970s. It is particularly true in the 1980s.
What became known as the debt crisis got underway in the early 1980s. However, it was a minor crisis for the banks, compared with the catastrophe facing the peoples of poor countries. The world's oldest human rights organization, the Anti-Slavery Society, has declared debt a contemporary form of slavery. Nowhere is this more vividly demonstrated than here in the Philippines, where 44% of the national budget is given to paying interest charges to foreign banks, compared with just 3% for health services. Moreover, billions of dollars continue to leave this country just to meet the interest on money borrowed by the dictator Ferdinand Marcos in deals that were often secret and fraudulent.
Okay, so you can watch the rest of that. I tried to mute it while I changed the microphone. However, yeah, I hope that works and doesn't hurt your ears. Okay, so that'll be in your research. Really great explanation that is more modern. This is from 2011. And I just thought the guy on here just explains it so succinctly and really real. And then, yeah, so we'll watch this and then we'll move on to some more discussion.
For research on globalization joins me now from Montreal, Canada. Hey there, Andrew.
Hi, thanks for having me.
The IMF, the World Bank, these created back in 1944, kind of to finance reconstruction in Europe and to develop the third world. But let's break down the evolution of what they've come to mean over the last half century. What's changed in terms of what they were supposed to be and what they've become?
Well, an important thing to keep in mind is that while they emerged out of the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, the plans to create them were actually implemented earlier. Specifically in 1941 and 1942, the Council on Foreign Relations, which is an elite U.S. think tank, developed war plans during the war with the State Department to redesign the global political economy, create a new world order in which America would be supreme. To do this, they came up with the idea for two major institutions, which became the IMF and the World Bank. These would essentially manage the third world, Latin America, Africa, Asia, for the benefit of U.S. and Western European corporations and banks.
But that's not the way it was sold. I mean, in some ways, it was sort of portrayed as, these institutions looking out for the poor countries, coming in to help them. And you just said it's actually benefiting the wealthier countries.
Yeah, well, just as you have to judge a person by what they do as opposed to just what they say, so too do you have to judge an institution on the same basis. Now, while the IMF and the World Bank say that they're interested in reducing poverty and development, all their actions have said otherwise, and the repercussions of their actions have exacerbated poverty created underdevelopment. You look at Africa and Latin America during the 60s, coming out of the colonial era, independence movements, these countries were developing quite rapidly in Africa. The growth rates were extreme until the oil crises, which were in fact, the oil price increases were supported by the US State Department. And this created a flood of money through the Western banking corporations being loaned to these developing countries to finance industrialization. In 1979, when the US Federal Reserve raised the interest rates so that they were 2% in the late 70s and 18% in the early 80s, all this money, all these loans, the interest rates dramatically increased, and this set off the 1980s debt crisis, which spread throughout Latin America, starting with Mexico and across Africa and Asia. This led to the World Bank and IMF coming to the scene to rescue these developing nations by making them restructure their economies.
And it seems, Andrew, they're not just restructuring their economies to try to pay back this debt. A lot of times they're restructuring the entire landscape of their country. I mean, you take these gorgeous rainforests in some of these third world countries, places where certainly a lot of things could come out of, and they're having to, tear these down to build crops, to make money, to pay back their debt. What do you make of all this? And what do you make of the fact that, the IMF and the World Bank have this meeting and they're talking about these policies and how to fix things when a lot of critics at least say they're the ones who caused this?
Absolutely, and they had a significant role in creating this crisis. They essentially act as neo-colonial institutions. Like you pointed out, they have to deconstruct rainforests and agriculture and focus on what's called export-induced growth. So producing, say, a cash crop. Like in Rwanda, they were forced to produce coffee for export because this was portrayed as something that would dramatically increase production, gave the country benefits, economic benefits, growth, etc. But if you look at the formal colonial era in Africa of European empires controlling the regions, it was done in the same way. They make countries produce certain crops for export to the European nations, and then thus making the countries dependent on the European nations for food and other services. So it creates a dependency. So the IMF and World Bank have essentially created this global dependency of the South, Africa, Asia, Latin America, on Western Europe and North America, which heavily subsidize their agricultural products for export. And in terms of today, they're trying to do how these institutions have changed today specifically is that not only are they interested in continuing to manage the so-called developing world, but they're also trying to integrate and advance the process of global governance by bringing in emerging nations such as China and India and other nations into this institutional apparatus of global governance, by bringing them to the game, essentially.
Andrew, let's talk about accountability here. I mean, again, these organizations, IMF, World Bank, meeting about policies, thinking ahead, trying to figure out what to change. The fact is, from what I understand at least, if you work for the World Bank, you're basically immune from any kind of legal action. Who are these organizations accountable to in terms of making sure that they actually are doing what they say they're going to do?
They're accountable to the interests that own them. And it's very simple to actually see who runs these institutions. If you take the World Bank historically, many of its presidents have always come from or been somehow related to Chase Manhattan Bank, which is now JP Morgan Chase. If you look at the second president of the World Bank, John J. McCloy, he was chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. He was chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was chairman of the Ford Foundation, a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation. So the interests that run these institutions are very well represented in their actions. But from the rhetoric of serving the poor, you just have to sort of put that aside. That's not a reality.
All right, Andrew Gavin Marshall from the Center for Research on Globalization joining us.
The Center for Research on Globalization. I must look into that. So, now I want to connect some dots. The World Trade Organization, yes, related to the World Trade Center, the towers that fell in New York. There's World Trade buildings in lots of cities all over the world. The World Trade Center, World Trade Organization, those are all the same. And essentially, it is a government making decisions for the whole world without any say from any of the people in that world toward this one world government. Now, stay with me here. As he was saying, we go in, we make them dependent, we make them produce one thing, yada yada. It's a cycle, it goes on, we take the resources. 9/11, if you haven't watched my video on that, please do. But 9/11 was a attack essentially to get us into a never-ending war. It was essentially an illusion, not in that the towers didn't fall, but in that our government knew it was going to happen, and whether they did or not, just watch my 9/11 video. And the shit ton of stuff that the 9/11 architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, you can ecosia.org search that. Their resources are also in my 9/11 video on the Shakti report on Livestream. So please access that. But this was to get us into a never-ending, proxy war, essentially with countries who refuse to go on the U.S. petrodollar / World Trade Organization / World Bank. So that's why we attacked Syria. Russia in 2011, they were considering being on the World Trade Organization, being part of it, but they had all these stipulations for being in it. They kept a lot of sovereignty, all right? So now getting back to the nationalism versus globalism thing, nationalism is about keeping sovereignty. It's about not just merging with every other culture, exporting all of our jobs to other countries. And so now I want to touch a little bit on a really big protest. And I posted pictures in the event, and I hope some of you will download them and share them and talk about this in particular. But this video is so that we can start thinking about what does it mean to protest, and how do we actually tell when a protest is real. So here we have on the sticker, Women United Against Globalization. The little kid has a WTO with a devil sign. So this is what's responsible when we say, don't, boycott China, free Tibet. This is what we're talking about. And we don't even know it because our culture has been so put in cognitive dissonance about what is really going on. So, especially I would say the millennial generation, well, I don't know. I think it's dispersed through all generations. And it's just those of us who knew, I knew for a long time before I said anything to anyone. Those of us who knew, didn't want to get into those conversations because they're uncomfortable. But now we're seeing that there's no other way around it because we care about life, and it's getting bad. So essentially what happened was in the 90s, you've heard about NAFTA, essentially, because that was a big thing that was hurled against the Clinton administration. So the husband, the other Clinton that was president earlier, I guess she's not president, but I don't know, whatever. So the Clinton that was president was responsible for the NAFTA arrangement, North American Free Trade Agreement, and this was essentially a free trade agreement on the WTO between the North American countries. Now, here we have Americans defending their forests because the WTO is trading, you know, our resources with other countries' resources without our knowledge for the enrichment of a very few private corporations that are part of the World Bank investments. So taking our forests so they can trade them around with other nations and essentially enslave other nations. So this was 1999. There was a huge riot. I suggest watching the movie. It's free on YouTube, called Battle of Seattle. And Charlize Theron is in it. She doesn't have a huge part, but and somebody else that's pretty famous. I can't remember his name right now. Anyhow, so it's a good movie, and those of you who are at Standing Rock, you know, you will, you know, relate a lot. But it was a huge protest that shut down the city and essentially brought militarized police into the streets against the citizenry. And you know, people were injured, and I don't know exactly the death count and toll, but the chief of police of Seattle resigned a couple days after all of that was over, because it was so traumatizing for everyone. You know, I think it was the first time we really exercised the militarized police against the people, and I didn't realize that that had happened before 9/11. I know that there was a lot of that in the 70s, or, you know, the end of the hippie protesting the war era, but also the militarized police wasn't the same thing it is today. But so that's something to know about, and also to just realize that this is the enemy. You know, if there is an abuser that is devaluing all our lives and all of our cultures and all of our resources. So this was Hong Kong in 2005, and essentially what I'm seeing from the left is that they've usurped some angry people who have every right to be angry, but don't understand that being anti-nationalist, first of all, nationalist does not equate to racist. Nationalist simply means you take pride in your people and your way of life, and you like your traditions, and you like, you know, having a stable economy, and, you know, there's something to be said about, like, not just having free and open borders. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, again, please look at the European model for the free and open borders. They are in a lot of trouble right now, in multiple different ways in all different countries. Catalonia is trying to secede. So, you know, this word is being redefined for us for a reason, because at that time in 99, people knew that the Democrats were globalists, you know. I think that's one reason why GW might have, I don't know, gotten in. I mean, that election was really shady. I don't know. No, was that the second one? No, that was the second one that was really shady. I guess the first one might not have been so shady. It was Al Gore, I think, running against him. So maybe it was shady too. I don't know. However, the point being, the people had very much identified Democrat as the globalist. All right. So then we go to Bush, and Bush expands more of the same agenda. He gives us 9/11. He gives us war for oil and opium in Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan. And now then Obama, you know, we swing back the other way. We say, you know, this is the way, and non-racism, and we have a black president now. And he expands those 3 proxy wars into 8 or 9. I would have to look. But including but not limited to Libya, Yemen, Syria, I think Turkey as well, but I'm not sure about that one. But I know I'm forgetting 1 or 2. So he expanded all of that, and all of this globalization, again, getting back to how does this fit into globalization? The reason we are going into these proxy wars is only with countries that reject being part of the World Trade Organization. Why do they reject being part of the World Bank and the World Trade Organization? Because they reject globalism, because they reject being open to the U.S. coming and owning their stuff and exploiting their people for labor and taking their resources. Sovereignty, nationalism. They are fighting nationalism abroad, and they are fighting nationalism here. And here it's crazier because the, you know, supposed progressive voices that are so accepting and open are trying to shut down free speech in the name of equating nationalism with racism. And just to clarify, some of these speakers at universities, I have gone and listened to a couple things they said only because of all this crap. Otherwise, I would have no idea who they are. And yeah, a couple of them, I would say I definitely in my mind would categorize them as racist. But guess what? It's not a crime. They are not doing a crime. The freedom of speech, we are the only country in the world that has the freedom of speech. And there's a reason for that. People aren't allowed to voice dissent. People aren't allowed to print a story about whatever they want. That First Amendment protects the freedom of the press, even if they're wrong. Because the people who ran away from the globalist colonization tyranny that settled this and did tyrannical things of their own to settle this, and maybe we just have to get our own karma and be so stupid as to walk straight into what we ran away from to settle this country, c'est la vie. However, that is what we were going away from. We were going to be sovereign, to be a sovereign nation. That's why you hear that term. We were going to be nationalists. We were going to reject our old nation and its way of, you know, tyrannically controlling and taxing and all of that. And now we're right back in this boat. So the reason I'm making this video is because when you look at things like, you know, that little boy with the women united against the World Trade Bank, whatnot, that is saying something, right? But what do? We have a women's march with pussy hats. Now, what's the point of that? Let's take a look. The point of that is that in this march, who's welcome? All women. Who doesn't support the women's march? Sexist, racist, pro-Trump people. If you don't support the women's march, you're a fascist, you're racist. So automatically, that's that. And who's invited? Everybody who loves women and all women. Well, who doesn't love women? I mean, yeah, maybe there's a few like effed up, but even like the most effed up people love women. They're just really effed up. Like there's, I mean, in our culture, at least, that is the way it is. Women, yeah, you can argue we've been suppressed, we've been put down, but we're also like the queen bees, you know, like we're like honored. And yeah, like in our American culture, the woman is beautiful. She's in charge of the house. You know, there is all this other, you know, chauvinist stuff around it, but it's all again like which side of the coin are you looking at, you know? So to make it into like, if you don't wear a pussy hat and march because we're for all women, which was incidentally really a sign of being for Hillary Clinton and getting the mob mentality to reveal any woman that wasn't for Hillary Clinton, so therefore she was against women. Okay, which is totally ironic because Hillary is the one that's against women. Anyone who's done this much research on her can figure that out. All right, and the second thing, okay, so Nazis and fascists. Who doesn't hate Nazis and fascists in this country, right? And before I get onto this, let me just digress onto a previous point from the video we watched earlier about how in 1941 the World Bank was made. Well, after World War II, one of the big problems and one of the big reasons why we're having so much cognitive dissonance in our country right now is because the history that we were taught about World War II and after World War II was highlighting certain heroic aspects and neglecting other unconstitutional, monopolizing, and detrimental aspects, which was why people like Aldous Huxley and George Orwell were able to write books that we are now seeing happen. And many, many, people like that, because they understood what was happening when it was happening. And we've lost so much touch with that because we got kind of doped into this happiness and bliss is everything. So I really recommend that I have so many videos in my heart and mind that I want to do, but I really recommend that you go back and look at the usurpation of our medical system, our energy system. There are many different kinds of energy. There's a specific reason why we can basically only get oil and nuclear. And it, again, has to do with sinister money and, all of that. There's a great documentary which is good for starting that kind of digging called The Oil Oligarchy, Oil-I-Garchy. So yeah, I highly recommend you watch that to start that. But okay, so for my last point on, how we recognize this co-optery, okay, and on the pussy hat thing, there's no demand. It's just we hate Trump, there's no demand, there's nothing, Okay, so the second point, Nazis and fascists. Who doesn't hate Nazis and fascists? That's like a given, right? We've all been, I mean, unless you are a Nazi or fascist, but that is the 2%, tiny portion of our society, and it's being hyped up and also psyoped and worked on, and that's another video. But basically, and this is a fact you can go look up, and so you'll understand what I'm saying about psyop, is that Obama legalized the psyops that were being used abroad for geopolitical regime change. He made it legal to use those psyops on the American people and has been doing so for the past 8 years or whatever it is since then. So you can go look that up. Obama makes psyop on American people legal. ecosia.org. Moving on. So the last point, Nazis and fascists. Who doesn't hate Nazis and fascists? So we have another Antifa and these protests for these Nazis and fascists, as it were. Again, all I see is conservative nationalists and perhaps maybe a little bit racist, but they're not sitting there saying, they're not talking about killing off races or any of that kind of stuff, which I have seen printed in the papers, and I've done a lot of digging and I can't find that anywhere. It just seems like somebody put that out there or twisted something that was once said maybe somewhere, but by no means. Anyhow, go research them yourself is the point. Nazis and fascists, who doesn't hate them? So we all hate them, so we're all supposed to be part of Antifa, is what I have gathered. And if you're not part of Antifa, then you must be a Nazi sympathizer or a fascist. So this is another just example of what this kind of co-optery and disabling and turning the people against the people on a witch hunt for each other does. And there's an effort to shut down people who are speaking of conservative values and nationalist values. And I think that it should, be very much questioned on why there, are Antifa getting free hotel rooms and perks to go and be violent at a protest. Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, there was no protest until they showed up. Like, there's not going to be a protest. There's going to be a speaker. And now there's going to be a protest because you're protesting someone speaking, and now it's going to turn violent, but you're anti-fascist, but you're shutting someone up. So we're the only country in the world with freedom of speech, and we have not, our generation and Generation X has not fought for any of the freedoms that we have, and we don't really realize what that all means, and why so much blood was actually shed to make this country at one time. Now blood is shed for absolutely no reason but this globalist agenda. That's the point of this. So, yeah, and really hate speech equals no more free speech. That's the beginning of the end. Like, I didn't even know. I just found out recently that Canada has hate speech, and I thought Canada had freedom of speech like we do, but apparently they don't have a constitution, and I don't know if any other country has a constitution for its citizens' rights, because that is our inalienable rights. So it's a very special thing, and one that culturally unites us, and one that is worth, I think, everyone's time in researching a little bit and exploring and questioning. And definitions are something that can be taken really quick, and I've just seen this pattern, and I really wanted to go look up some definitions and get clearer about the history of it. But at this point, I really think that, the anti-globalization movement was huge in '99 and all the way through really 2005, and it's really lost steam, and I think it's a co-opting, psyoping of that movement to piggyback in this cognitive dissonance with all these flying monkeys onto the Democratic Party. And I think the younger generation, since they didn't understand the 90s, they didn't understand what Clinton actually did, and they even didn't really understand what Obama just did, a lot of them. So because of that, it creates a huge cognitive dissonance, and the millennials are the largest population alive right now. So we really have a big responsibility to get it right and to make an effort to get it right, because that's the best we can do, right? So I, love the freedom of speech. I love our Constitution. I will be talking more about it soon. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Shakti Report on this lovely Saturday. Wherever you are, I hope you have many blessings and much love. And I will be on tomorrow talking about some possible Christmas gifts, and they will be unique and sustainable and from real people and artisans in the USA. And other than that, I'm just gonna say winter's coming, but let's enjoy this fall and a little Ziggy Marley.
On the beach in Hawaii. I wish you were here with me, walking on the beach in Hawaii, laying on the golden sand, looking at the ocean. Now I'm on the sand. Love is like a open sea, and I wish you were here with me.